Morning, Peter. It's absolutely delightful to be here. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us for the CEO Insight series for Changeosity.
Morning, Kieran.
We're looking forward to speaking to you, and we really want to deepen our understanding of some of your stories, some of your real lessons learned from the past. You're Peter England, you're CEO of RAK Bank, is listed on the Abu Dhabi Securities Exchange. And if I may first, I'm really interested to get to the bottom of brand Peter, who Peter actually is. So could you tell me, first of all, from your perspective, what is the secret to your success as a leader?
Yeah, look, I think you've got to start from the start to a point and sort of look at where someone came from and how they got to where they got. So, you know, my background was, to be very frank, from quite humble beginnings. I grew up on a small farm in a little country town, and like most people did in those days, you know, they left school and went and found a job somewhere, and it just happened to be that I found a job in a bank. So my first job was actually making up cardboard boxes in a little branch in a very small country town. And I had no great ambitions to ever become the CEO of a bank. It almost kind of just happened along the way. But I think one of the beauties of starting with such humble beginnings is I really learnt everything about banking, and I learnt everything about business and management and so many things right from the grassroots. And I think that's really put me in good stead as I've moved forward in my career, because at the end of the day, you know, for example, if I go and implement a major change in our organisation, I am not too bad at figuring out the implications of that pretty much through the entire organisation and how that could affect everyone. So I think that's really been something that's shaped who I am. And you know, I think in many cases leaders come to places from different places, but I think in my case at least that's probably been one of my big keys to success.
And that connection to grassroots that you talk about, can you tell me more about that in the context of how that connects to your values?
Well, I think it's that you understand. Well, firstly, you understand the value of hard work to make something happen, right? You know, when things aren't handed to you on a platter, when you need to work your way up through an organisation, when you need to go through, in some cases, quite difficult financial times. For example, as a youngster, you know, you weren't given a Ferrari on a plate as a young boy or whatever it may be. You know, you learn so much of those core values, which I think are extremely important in leadership and in life generally.
Yeah. And you've mentioned being humble. You've mentioned hard work. What else are values to you?
Yeah, I think for me one of the other big things, and I don't know where this particularly came from, but is about innovation, because you know, I think one thing that I have been very good at and probably better at than most people that started in the same place I started, was really seeing that there are changes happening in the world and you have to adapt and innovate. And you know, the downside of not doing so is literally you become a dinosaur. And I think that's extremely important, not just for RAK Bank, not just for the UAE, but globally, to have leaders that can, for whatever reason, just not see the future exactly, but be able to gather information and data around them and just get a sense for, well, we need to change this direction, we need to move in this area. And most importantly, you know, what the future of banking or whatever industry you're in may be as time goes by.
And how do you think ensure that an organisation like RAK Bank, how do you ensure that it remains aligned with both its corporate values and your values as a leader of that organisation? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's a multifaceted thing, right? You know, we're not a globally large organisation, but at the same time, we're not a small organisation. We have about 4,000 people working for us. And I think it's very easy for leaders to become quite detached again to what is going on at the ground. So I think it's very important for leaders to listen to both their people and, most importantly nowadays, their customers, because that's where you really understand whether the values that you believe you are sort of growing throughout the organisation are actually taking place or not. I spent a huge amount of time, answering emails from clients, complaining about something or questioning why we do something the way we do it. And I do it very deliberately because, to be honest, if you can, cut yourself off from your customers and your staff, then how on earth are you supposed to know whether these things are actually happening in the company or not? And I think that's extremely important. And it's interesting, actually, the feedback I get from clients when they get a personal response from the CEO. And the way I read it, the way I write it, it's obvious it's from me and not from some sort of automated robot or something. I think is also very valuable to the organisation itself.
Yeah.
And the reality is, in a organisation of whatever size it is, there's going to be plenty of times you don't get things right. And the only way, as I said, you can really grow and evolve and improve the organisation is by understanding what the issues are. I think on the sort of other side of that coin, when I talked about innovation and the future, one of the most important things a leader can do is spend a lot of time reading, researching, looking at articles, whatever it may be. I don't spend a huge amount of time reading management books, but I spend a lot of time, reading the Financial Times and reading various banking journals and a whole range of things, and non-banking things as well, to get an understanding of what's going on, what the changes may be that are coming forward, and really, trying to firm a view and as to how this organisation should proceed moving forward.
So what that sounds like is that you take yourself onto a balcony almost, to have a balcony view of what's going on around you. You're actually looking up. So from your perspective, what impact does that have on people, both your clients as well as your employees? Yeah,
look, I think the first thing is, as I said, you've got to actually do both. One is that helicopter or balcony view or whatever you want to call it, and the other one is the connection with the grassroots. So it's how you tie those two things together. But in the case of taking a helicopter view or balcony view, it is also, one of my main roles is helping my people understand why we need to do things. It's all well and good to say, oh, we need to, change the way we work, or we need to consider the threat of digital, but it's also helping them understand the implications of not doing so. And, I think this is something that I see in so many organisations, and actually I saw it absolutely in RAK Bank. When I came to RAK Bank, this was a hugely successful organisation, but if we hadn't made the fundamental changes we've made in the last 6 years, I'm not sure we'd still be here. Because the world had changed so much, the UAE had changed so much, that business model that was perfectly great for 10 years or whatever it may be, or 15 or 20 years, was just not going to cut it going forward. So, I think it's about just taking, as I said, taking those two factors of very high level view and a very grassroots level view, and sort of moulding them together.
Yeah. So what you've described, Peter, is a very sort of people-led leadership style. Have you ever let that brand down?
Yeah, look, I have. I think there's been times where, I may have been, one of the things about me is my sort of philosophy in management style is employing very capable people and letting them get on with it. And I think that has some very powerful elements, but it also has some elements that can cause challenges, right? So, when you trust people and you believe that they will implement whatever it is that you want them to implement, or will have the common sense and the intelligence to do it themselves, the downside of that, of course, is if they don't do that, right? Or if they're too slow to make changes, or they outright end up not doing what they said they were going to do, that can be a challenge. So I think for me, that's something that I've learnt, that you've got to give that autonomy and freedom, but at the same time you have to make sure you have the occasional check and balance to make sure that it's actually happening on the ground. And that's something that, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's just that you can't be too trusting. But I think if you don't do that, then at the same time you end up with the bigger problem I've seen with this sort of command and control environment that so many managers adopt rather than leaders, I would say, that you end up with a scenario where, people just have no ability to be creative and do different things. So, you know, I think there's always downsides there's always sort of different things you can modify and do, but to me, the broad approach of allowing people to just grow and develop and get on with things, but as I said, having those checks and balances to make sure that things do get done the way they need to get done.
Yeah. And I find we are living in very disruptive times right now. I mean, we're amidst quite a lot of uncertainty at the moment with coronavirus, with what's happening on the markets at the moment, with the US elections coming, trade wars looming their ugly head again. So if I may, I want to take you onto the balcony actually, give you, you know, go on that helicopter with you. And I want to ask you a little bit about your legacy. What do you want your legacy to be when you close those doors to your office for the last time when you move on from RAK Bank? What does legacy look like to you?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to have, you know, well-established infrastructure, and by infrastructure I don't mean physical buildings and computers, though you need those as well, right? But well-established infrastructure in terms of, you know, proper thought process around how a bank or any organisation should run in 2020 and beyond. So you need to get those sort of basic things in place. I think, you know, at the end of the day, one thing I don't believe in is that I should have this organisation in such a manner that it is so entrenched in a certain way of leadership, which in this scenario is my leadership, that it can't, you know, grow and develop and change going forward. Now, of course, that all comes down to who ends up taking over that legacy, right? But, and again, from my experience when I came here 6 years ago, you know, this organisation was so entrenched in a certain way of thinking and acting, a very, very command and control, very procedural driven, you know, you must do what says in the procedures, don't think outside the box. And it's taken me, you know, close to, well, not 6 years, but it took me a good 3 or 4 years to really change the organisation to stop thinking like that, you know, and I still see parts of it today, you know, that occasionally crop up out of the middle of nowhere, and I think, my goodness, are we still thinking like this 6 years later? So as I said, I think it's important on one level to have everything in place so someone else can come and sort of continue that legacy, but don't lock the organisation too much into my way of thinking, because, you know, it worked for now and it's right for now, but it may not be right in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or whatever that time frame is.
So let's talk a little bit about leading through change, leading through dramatic transformation, as you have done. We've read a lot in the press about how you've successfully captained a much broader diversification in the business. What change did you actually advocate, both from a cultural perspective as well as an actual physical perspective?
Well, look, I think, you know, to be fair, it's been across the board. I think on the cultural one, and again, I've used this word many times, you know, trying to get away from a complete command and control environment. And look, don't get me wrong, you know, in some scenarios, in certain environments, there needs to be an element of that. But I think the most important thing from a cultural perspective is really to, you know, have a lot more generation of ideas, a lot more ability for people to speak up and say, hey, you know, we've been doing this way, why on earth aren't we doing it that way? You know, I spend quite a lot of time, for example, with management trainees and some of the various training courses we run, and every time I say to these people, please, you know, bring your ideas up, for goodness sake, don't just take the view that you've got to sit in a box and stay in that box. Having said that, though, of course, to make sure that everyone understands that we will take lots of ideas and thoughts and bring them all together, and then when we do make a decision that we're going to go in a certain direction, that's the decision. I mean, I think that's equally important, because you can't always be continually changing and everything along the way. So I think that's sort of one, probably the most important factor, I think, from a cultural perspective, is really that inclusion. And it's across the board. It's not, as I said, it includes customers as well as staff from the lowest level to the most senior levels. I think on the business front, we've changed just about everything, to be very blunt. You know, we used to be a bank that it was what I called a sort of a one-horse sort of approach. It was one hero product and we were very good at that. And then when something went wrong with that hero product, we said, oh, let's go and have another hero product. The key theme that we have talked about in our organisation is business diversification. So nowadays, we are a fantastically diversified business. We, if we have a problem in one area, with a bit of luck, the other area might help us sort of see through those difficult times. And we didn't have that before. So I think that's been very important. In some times, niche is fantastic, but if you're a niche of one and that niche suddenly gets impacted by something, then you're in all sorts of strife. So I think that's been very, very important, and that's been a very interesting journey that we've been through. It's been about getting the board and the shareholders and everyone comfortable, and management comfortable, and all the staff, that RAK Bank should grow and diversify in these ways. And I think we've been hugely successful at that.
How did you do that? How did you connect so many different stakeholders in such a powerful way?
Yeah, look, I think it's it may be part of its character, hopefully. Certainly managing upwards, that's something that's extremely important. You have to help people understand that, okay, what we did before was, fantastic, but it's not going to work going forward. I was probably a little bit fortunate, in an unfortunate way, if I could say that, that the UAE went through what I would describe as an SME crisis, about a year after coming on into the bank. And, in some ways that sort of justified what I was saying, that, hey, look, this is all very well and good, but, we can't just rely on one thing. At the same time, it gave us a huge amount of challenge on the ground at the time. But in some ways it made my life easier, because, if something is fantastic and it's going very well, it's sometimes a bit harder to help people understand that there is a need for change. And that applied across the whole organisation.
And what do you think a common trap is for CEOs in that position of leading transformational change? What do you think a common trap is for them?
Look, I think there's a number of them. I think one of the biggest ones, and it almost sounds the opposite to what I just said before, or what I've said all along about, giving people autonomy and so forth. One trap is not making sure that change is actually taking place. And I alluded to this earlier when we talked about needing to have those checks and balances in place to make sure that's happening, because it is quite easy when you're sitting on the 11th floor or the 25th floor or whatever, however big your building is, to, as I said, not really know whether that change is implemented. And I think that's a common trap. The other one can be a little bit difficult, and it's not been the case for us, but sometimes trying to change everything, sometimes too much change, can just make the whole thing collapse. So I think you've got to be measured about it. You've got to make sure that the change you're making are in those areas that are absolutely essential. Obviously, if you see some challenges coming on the horizon and you need to react quickly. But at the same time, don't try to change everything at once. You need to just gradually, and unless there's a burning need to do so, I think you just have to gradually change things and move things in certain directions, and then I think that's the most appropriate way to move forward.
During that period, who or what were your game savers, would you say, when you were when you had an idea that you weren't necessarily getting the right messages, you weren't hearing the right information? What do you think was helpful?
Well, communication, absolutely. As I said, whether it comes from customers or it comes from staff or whoever it may be, make sure that you are open to feedback and thoughts. I mean, we've been through another major change in recent times, where we had to offshore some of our business because, for cost competitiveness, we had no choice. And we and my team and I made a huge sort of communication exercise to make sure that everyone understood why we were doing it, what we were doing. And sometimes the news to individuals was not that great, right? You might not have a job, or if you do, you might have to go and work somewhere else in another country. But so communication is really the key to all this. Don't just go and think that, okay, let's make this change and get on with it, and not communicate at all levels, as I said, up and down the organisation.
And when you're talking about communication, what are you What's communication?
Well, it can be everything, right? One is obviously physical communication, you know, going and meeting with a board member, or going and meeting with a shareholder, or meeting with actual staff members, management, and really just chatting about things, discussing why things are being done. But then, of course, there's the broader communication, which is the CEO's blog, or you know, other pieces of formal and informal communication that are very, very important.
Yeah. What was the biggest risk you think you took during that period?
Well, actually, I saw this in your questions, and I wouldn't say during that period. I'd say what's the biggest risk I took in my career, and it was, you know, leaving a job in Australia after I'd been in one bank for 18 years. I talked about the filing clerk story, or the boxmaker story. I was with that bank for 18 years, and I did a lot of very different things in that 18 years. It's not like I just did one job. To be fair, it was almost like changing organisations 5 times, but the reality is, you know, I worked for that one company for 18 years, and I got a call out of the blue saying, would you like to go and run a credit card business in Malaysia? And I sort of thought, maybe, I'm not sure where Malaysia is. I'm sounding very Australian here. But you know, that was a huge risk. But my goodness, it's the best thing I ever did in my life, was just say, right, let's go and make a start again. Different country, different organisation, different everything. And it's been the most fantastic thing I ever did in my life. And at the time, it seemed like the most risky thing I ever did in my life. Yeah. So that one paid off. You know, I'm sure there's little small risks that we've all taken that didn't work out. But
what was the payoff for you?
Oh, look, I think, well, one is I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. Would be the first thing. Hopefully, physically, I'd be sitting here, but not in this office, and not at RAK Bank, because the things that I learnt, you know, along the way in Asia, just put me in the perfect place to be the CEO of RAK Bank, you know, 6 years ago. But yeah, it was a huge risk from a personal level at the time. But without it, I just don't know what would have ended up. I probably would have ended up like most of my friends, you know, early retirement or retrenched or whatever happened to most of them, because they didn't grow and developed. They just saw this as, well, that's the job and that's how it's been, and for 18 years, and that's how it's going to be for another 18 years, and it's not going to be like that.
And do you feel that it was a risk to move from Malaysia to here?
No, I think my time in Malaysia was done. I'd spent time in Malaysia, I'd spent time in Singapore, but all up in Malaysia I was almost 15 years. And I think, you know, just like that first 18 years, it was time for a change. I mean, in Malaysia I worked for 4 different banks, so again I had plenty of change and different roles. But yeah, it was time. It was time to go and start the next chapter, and clearly that's what RAK Bank has been.
Okay. So that's a nice intro into us now looking a little bit into the future. And where I want to take you now, Peter, is just to talk about the topic of diversity and inclusion. Today is actually International Women's Day. And if I may, I just want to ask you about what your views are on diversity and inclusion, but from a decision-making perspective. What do you see as the connection in respect of decision-making for an organisation, and where diversity and inclusion plays a part?
Yeah, look, I think it is extremely important. I mean, I think RAK Bank was a rather interesting organisation, again, when I came here, where it was we had sort of one very strong nationality in the organisation, and it wasn't UA nationals, to be blunt. And I think that had its strength, but it also was a weakness, because we always sort of thought with a very sort of subcontinent view. We didn't think any differently to that. And you know, you had sort of the CEO and effectively the deputy CEO being Westerners, and most of the rest of the staff were Indians, to be fair. And I think it was good. It had its place and it worked well for a while, but you know, at the end of the day, we live in a very multicultural environment, and as you want to grow and develop into other areas in the UAE or the GCC or wherever you do business, you can't just have one way of thinking, right? So it was incredibly important for us as an organisation to bring in a whole range of new ideas, new people, new thought process, male and female, rather than a very male-dominated environment, which it was before, and really just bring all these ideas and thoughts together. And I think it is crucially important to how we grow and develop the organisation. At the same time, as I said, I think you've got to get all of these ideas and thoughts and then make a decision and move on.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that by having great diversity means that you will adopt everything, because that's just not going to work, right? But I think, yeah, diversity's been a key factor in why RAK Bank is so different today than it was 6 years ago. And it's diversity in everything, as I talked about earlier. It's diversity in the business that we do as much as our staff, as much as as everything else.
That's very true. Okay, I'm just going to pause you there because we're going to just change, and we're taking a breather, and we'll come back.